Hello, I'm Joy Gleason Carew. Welcome to our session. This is the second of our four-part series on race in focus. We have come together to engage in a much needed conversation about teaching on race and the continued disparities in our field of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies. Around the country and abroad, people in academia and elsewhere have been reflecting on the systemic inequities that have prevented the incorporation of the many diverse perspectives that could enrich our field of study. In this period of self-conscious reflection, not only institutions of higher learning, but also faculty members in many areas of study have begun to look critically into their respective fields to ferret out ways to address this legacy. Besides our University of Pittsburgh host for the webinar, our co-sponsors are centers of similar area studies stretching across the country, including the University of Chicago, University of Wisconsin-Madison, University of Michigan, University of Texas at Austin, Ohio State University, Harvard University, Indiana University of Bloomington, University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. Today's session, Engaging with Race and Racism in the Classroom, explores ideas and experiences of two scholars in the field, Dr. Raquel Green of Grinnell College in Iowa, and Dr. Chelsea West O'Heary of the University of Texas at Austin. Each will introduce herself and how she got into her field of study in turn, but I'll take a minute to share their formal bios with you. Before I do, a bit about me. I recently retired from the University of Louisville, where I taught in the Department of Pan-African Studies for the past 20 years. I'm originally from Chicago, but attended a progressive boarding school in Vermont, where I studied Russian. So after 4 years of taking Russian there and my love of my Russian teacher, I continued the Russian through undergraduate college and through my first two master's degrees. My first trip to Russia actually came under the auspices of Ohio State University in 1967. Through the 70s, I took many groups, my students and others, including professional groups, for study tours in the Soviet Union. I returned to what was then post-Soviet Russia in the 2000s, going in 2003, 2008, and 2015. My research and writing focuses on the experiences of African Americans and other Blacks who went to the USSR in the 20s and 30s. Now, some information on our other presenters. I'm sorry, I've lost their sheet. Dr. Raquel Green is an associate professor at Grinnell College, where she teaches all levels of Russian language and curriculum, as well as courses based on her research. Her research theme is the theme of the African in Russian literature and culture. She's especially well known as a scholar of interplay of race, ethnicity, and culture, and actively publishes in the fields of language pedagogy, Russian literature and culture, and children's literature. She's been active in improving diversity in student recruitment and in the teaching of Russian nationwide. Our other presenter is Dr. Chelsea West O'Heary, a cultural anthropologist and assistant professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She is interested in the configurations of race and belonging among Albanian, Romani, and Egyptian communities in Southeastern Europe. She also examines categories of whiteness and Blackness as they are produced and reproduced throughout Europe and across the globe. West O'Heary is currently completing her ethnographic book project about this project. I will now ask Dr. Raquel Green, to introduce herself and to share her material with us. In introducing yourself, Dr. Green, would you kindly tell us where you're from, how you got into this particular field, and what attracted you to your specific area of study?
Good afternoon. Thank you first to the University of Pittsburgh and to the co-hosts for having this program. I am originally from New York City, from the Bronx, and I started studying Russian in high school at the Bronx High School of Science. And I continued my study during my undergraduate years at the University of Virginia. And I decided to continue at the University of Arizona, and I completed my PhD at The Ohio State University. I began teaching at Grinnell College about 21 years ago. And while I was there during my first year, I was invited to develop a new course in the department. And my dissertation research focused on the writing of Alexander Pushkin and his African heritage. And during the course of my research, I came across a lot of references that didn't necessarily have to do directly with my dissertation, but I put them away thinking, you know, one day I will come back to these and do something with them. And when I got to Grinnell, I used a lot of those references and materials to develop a course called The Theme of the African in Russian Literature and Culture. My research focuses on constructions of race, specifically Blackness in Soviet children's literature. And I also teach courses in multicultural American children's literature. And I'm currently teaching a course, Theoretical Approaches to Children's Literature, where we look at the development of the African American canon in American children's literature. So that is a little bit about myself. And to begin my presentation, so today what I would like to do is discuss is to talk about how I discuss questions of race and racism in my teaching, with the focus on the experience of people of African origin in Russia and perceptions and depictions of Africans in contemporary Russian culture. These discussions have become a larger part of my teaching at Grinnell as we have seen more students of color, more African American students and more students of color in general choose to study abroad in Russia. The materials that I'd like to share specifically today, I use in the final unit of my course, The Theme of the African in Russian Literature and Culture. And just to give a brief overview of the course, it surveys the varying perceptions of Africa and people of African descent as reflected in pre-revolutionary, Soviet, and contemporary Russian literature and culture. We examine the history of Russian political and intellectual contact with the African diaspora and the impact that this contact has had on the development of the African as a literary theme in Russian and Soviet and post-Soviet literature as well. So we begin the course with the origins of Russian contact with Africa, the life of Pushkin's great-grandfather, Ibrahim Ganibal, the symbolic significance of Ganibal in his own time, and the theme of Africa in Pushkin's writing. In the 19th century, we go on to look at Russian polemics surrounding American slavery and how those writings were used as an oblique way to critique Russian serfdom. We also spend time discussing the experiences of African Americans who traveled to the Soviet Union. Well-known figures such as Claude McKay, Langston Hughes, Paul Robeson, and also lesser-known figures, both African American and African, whose lived experiences did not always live up to the Soviet ideal. The final part of the course examines contemporary perceptions of people of African origin in Russia, in the Russian media, and in various aspects of Russian culture. So as someone who primarily teaches language and literature and culture in translation to students who don't speak Russian, it can be challenging to find points where they are able to address race in a way that doesn't feel artificial or purely theoretical. So I want to share some of my experiences in figuring out how to use authentic Russian materials, visual text, cultural artifacts to facilitate moments where students are critically engaging with various aspects of popular Russian culture, even when they don't know the language. And what I have found is that students have been more engaged in discussions about race and popular representations, especially more contemporary contexts. And I would like us to look at a few of those instances in which knowing Russian has not been crucial necessarily to interpreting or talking critically about a visual text. And the first text that I would like to share is from, if I can figure out how to share my screen. Okay. What am I doing or not doing? Oh, share screen. And let me move this up, hopefully. Okay, so the first cartoon that I would like to share is from a series called "Ну Погоди", and it is, in surveys, it has been named the most popular Russian or Soviet animated series of all times. And just to set this up for you, I watched this in class, and we watched one before this, a very short clip, and then I decided to play this one. And I didn't introduce it in any way, I just showed it and decided to wait for reactions. And so in "Ну Погоди", it's very similar to Tom and Jerry, where you have a cat who's constantly in battle with Jerry, the mouse, and Jerry always winds up getting the better of Tom. And in "Nu Pagadi", we have a fox who's constantly at battle with the rabbit, and the rabbit generally winds up winning. So I just want to share a brief clip and then talk about how I discuss it with my students.
Не сыпь мне соль на рану, она еще болит.
hopefully you can still see me. And so after I show the clip, I don't give any reaction at all. And one time, one of my students just looked at me and said, "Professor Green," and then they looked at their classmates and said, "Guys, is there nothing wrong with this?" And I said, "Okay, so let's talk about that. What if anything is problematic?" And they proceeded to do a wonderful job of deconstructing, right, all of the problematic racial tropes and images, right? The notion that these are savage hares, they are uncivilized, they are ready to eat the fox alive. Do more than eat this fox alive is dance, right? That's the one thing that is able to distract them. So obviously they are, they're rhythmically gifted, right? And so we talk about it in the context of when it appeared on television. This was part of a 25th anniversary series of Nupagadi, and it appeared on television in 1994. So what is happening in Russia in 1994? Well, in 1994, we're already in the new Russia. Communism has fallen in 1991, and as we know, the new Russia is plagued with racism. In the 1950s and the 1960s, media outlets were instructed to educate Soviet masses that racism, ethnic hatred had dissolved as a part of a new consciousness. And setting that agenda was easy. There is a party-controlled monolithic press system before glasnost, racial, but afterwards it begins to express itself in very blatant ways. And what I quickly want to add is that as part of a final project, students do research on an aspect of post-Soviet attitudes towards race. And some of them have looked at the lives of international sports stars. Some of them have looked at the influence of international music traditions such as rap and hip hop. So we watch these images, we deconstruct and talk about these images, but we do this in a broader context where they are actively doing research on aspects of Russian culture as well. And so the next slide that I would like to show is from a song called The Chocolate Bunny Rap, 2003. And when I first play it, but I play it with the volume down. And I just say, hey, I've discovered this new R&B artist or this new rap artist. Are you familiar? And I start to play the video, but without the sound. And of course, none of my students have heard of this person because he's performing in Russian. But I just want to play a small clip from the video and then discuss how we discuss it. Okay. If it will play. Okay, it is not cooperating. So we will move on then for the sake of time. But essentially, the song is called Chocolate. Oh.
ладошку положу. Аккуратно с красным бантом я обертку развяжу. Аппетитно, очень сытно, эта форма все влечет.
Okay, and I think we all sort of get the point, but the chorus of the song is the chocolate bunny rabbit, the tender sweet, the chocolate bunny rabbit, and in your lips, I will melt so easily, is essentially what the song is about. And so, you know, my students laugh, and then we talk about, okay, when you were watching it, what did you think without the volume? And they just assumed that it was just another American R&B song or rap song, right? And then we talk about, why are you able to make those assumptions? What are some of the things that we see in this video, right, that are familiar to us from American rap or R&B videos? And we talk about this question of cultural appropriation and how, you know, when things are appropriated, they're not necessarily the most positive aspects of a culture. So what do we see happening? And even in this short clip, we see it, right? So we see voyeurism, we see hypersexualization of the Black body. You know, this one African man who's surrounded by multiple white women. We see colorism. The few women of color who appear to be of African origin are very fair-skinned, right? Have a certain texture of hair. And this harkens back to critiques of American music videos and how for the longest time, you did not see darker skinned women in rap videos, in R&B videos. And that's changing, but that was sort of the standard for many, many years. And again, talking about cultural appropriation, how the music traditions, American music traditions, right, have become embedded in many ways in contemporary Russian culture and very popular among young Russians. The next video that I would like us to look at briefly, my students are very surprised when they learn that I'm familiar with the program, The Boondocks, that I actually, you know, I watch it quite frequently. But I asked them, and this is just a very, very short clip. I say, listen at the beginning, how is Boondocks translated into Russian? And let's see if I can.
I am the stone, yeah. The refused, I am the miserable.
So if you caught that, it's translated as ghetto. And so we talk about, you know, as a native speaker of English, when you hear the word the Boondocks, it conjures up certain images, right? It certainly does not conjure up images of the inner city and of the ghetto. When you say the Boondocks, you're talking about the middle of nowhere, right? The country, or even, you know, even worse than the country, right? In some instances. So why is the term ghetto used? Why is it translated that way into Russian, right? And what is being implied by using that term, right? What images are being conjured up? What assumptions are we making? Or do we think we'll be able to make about the characters, right, in this animated series? So it's just an interesting thing to think about. And then one of the last things that we do is to talk about the image of President Obama. And, you know, for Americans, for many Americans, it was, I mean, it was just a huge symbolic event, important on so many levels. And I wanted to show them how his image has been appropriated. There's not so much a concern about copyrights and the use of copyrights, but let's take a look at some of the images that we encounter. So this first one is smoking kills more people than Obama. Even though Obama kills many people, don't smoke. You don't need to look like Obama. And this image of him, first of all, it shows him obviously smoking, but it's a much darker ground. It makes him look evil, right? And then let's take a look at another one that we've discussed. It's on everyone's lips, dark in white. And what is this advertising? It's an advertisement for ice cream, right? And Obama has sometimes been described as, chocolate covering vanilla, right? The vanilla representing his white mother. And this is another advertisement for ice cream, Obamka, which is a diminutive, so a little Obama. So this is a chocolate cream ice cream. And again, we have Sun People, Friends of Beauty. A good tan is a direct path to the presidency. And let's look here. So the world is, the world or suntans rule the world. Are you suntanning? So again, making plays on him as a man of color. And these are somewhat, I would say that these are somewhat neutral, well, except for the first one, these are somewhat neutral. But here we have another one that is an ad for an automobile wash, for a car wash. And it says, wash away all of, churnta is like dirt. And this is the car wash, Obama, welcome. And here the notion of, Blackness being associated with uncleanliness, right? A lack of hygiene. And this picture of Obama clearly is not, it's not a positive representation of him. When students are studying abroad, and this will be my last point, they want to know what to expect. And I think seeing these images combined with the individual research that they're doing gives them a sense of the changing perceptions of Africans, people of African origin over time. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Green, and we're sorry about the technical glitch. We will entertain questions, but I'd like to put them to the end after we have our two major presentations. So at this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Chelsea West O'Leary of the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. West O'Leary, please go ahead. Introduce yourself and your material. And of course, in doing that, please tell us something about where you come from, what led you to the field, and in particular, what led you to your particular area of study. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really want to just say thank you to both Joy and Raquel for that we've worked together to put this panel together, and thank you to the organizers, as well as thank you to people, organizers at the University of Pittsburgh and ACES and co-host. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to share my presentation here. So to give a bit of background about myself, I first traveled to Albania in the summer of 2006 I am from Jackson, Mississippi, and I went to college across the street from my high school. So I actually never, in fact, I also went to high school across the street from my elementary and middle school. So I kind of stayed in a 0.5 mile radius my entire life. And I had traveled some in the United States, but I'd actually never left the US. And one of my cousins who had grown up in the South like me had gone up north to go to college, and she had traveled abroad, and she was just so grateful for her experiences to learn more about life outside of the US. And so she was actually very angry with me when I decided that I was going to not only stay in my home state to go to school, but that I was literally going to college across the street. And so she would just stay on me about broadening my horizons and learning more about life outside of the US. And she also too, we both grew up in places with very particular histories and context around race, and you'll see why this factors in later. And because of the racism that she had experienced, especially in high school, and she was just also very concerned about me not seeing life outside of the US South. And so as a result, I made it known to some of my professors that I was interested in studying abroad, and received an invitation from an anthropology professor who I hadn't yet taken a course with, but he invited me to participate in an ethno-archaeological project in Albania. And in fact, when he first made the offer, I had an idea of where Albania was, but I went back to my dorm room to check my globe, and I had a globe at the time, to make sure I knew where I was going. And I didn't know much of anything about Albania at all. The only person in my family who knew something about Albania was my dad, because he was very much into history, and in particular, had done some reading about former Yugoslavia. But other than that, well, no one in my family knew where Albania was. No one in my family also knew what anthropologists did. And at this time, I was still convinced that I was gonna either go to law school. I had already just told my family that I wasn't going to go to med school like I initially thought in college, but I was also pretending to be an English major who was taking a few anthropology classes, so to speak, because my family was just so concerned about me being an anthropologist. And after going to Albania that particular summer, 2006, though, I was pretty sure that I wanted to study anthropology full time. And a lot of that happened because I learned that summer that I was actually a terrible archaeologist. And so here I am in this picture here. This is in an area, Indurlusai, which is in the Shala Valley. It's in the high northern mountains of Albania. And we were doing survey archaeology with this part of the project. And so we would survey structures like this, but a lot of our time was spent actually in people's broader fields and their properties that they owned. And we'd get permission from the landowners or the house owners to survey in the property. And what would often happen is that once I began with my clicker, I would be approached by someone in the family, or someone would see me, and I didn't speak Albanian at the time, but many people had never met a Black person before, and some didn't have television, so they hadn't seen Black people before either. And so I learned very quickly the words for come. A lot of people would say haida, which is actually has Persian and Turkish roots, but like come, or eya, like come here, as well as cafe, coffee, right? And so I was often forced to join people for coffees. And I say forced because sometimes people would actually grab my hand and just pull me away from my survey tract. But they were extremely kind and nice. I don't know what people were saying at the time. Again, I didn't speak Albanian then. Now that I do, I often imagine, what people may have been talking to me about. Sometimes someone in the house, maybe the grandfather who lived there, would be going on and on for 30 minutes before somebody from the archaeology team might find me, or might hear my name being called because I wasn't where I was supposed to be. And after a few weeks of this, that professor, who's now a mentor and very good friend, he said, maybe you're very well suited to just focus on the cultural anthropology. And so, that's what I was able to do. And he actually invited me to participate in the project the following year, because he'd been doing archaeology at this point for numerous years in Albania. And so I went back the following year, and he supervised me as I conducted research for an honors thesis, in which I got much more interested in ideas around nationalism and hip hop at that time. And this is what paved the way for me to begin to focus much more on race in Albania. And And so in 2009, I began a graduate program at the University of Texas in Austin, an MA PhD program in anthropology, and continued my focus on Albania. And at that time too, I began to think more critically about race and racialization, which I had always already been doing, especially thinking about my own encounters in Albania. But at the time, I felt like I had a lens of just nationalism and ethnicity without giving a lot of consideration to race. And in some ways, I felt that I was encouraged not to look at race because there was an idea of an assumed racelessness, or that like race was just a US construct, and that it or Western construct that wasn't helpful for understanding Albania. So those questions and those tensions have animated both my research and the work that I do right now, as well as the courses that I teach. And so I'm an anthropologist. I'm in a Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies. And the course that I am currently teaching, so actually I'll start with the course up top. So the first course here, Comparing White Nationalism, is a course that I taught for the first time in the spring of 2020. It's an undergraduate level course, seminar style, about 25 to 30 students, and it's a writing intensive course. And in this class, the students and I work pretty much in 3 parts, where we're really just trying to define and understand what is white nationalism, what is white, what is nationalism, what is nation. And we really get into a lot of a discussion and defining key concepts and understandings from a global perspective. And I'm gonna share in a bit some pedagogical tools that I use to do this. And then we spend the second part of the course looking at white nationalism in a global perspective and understanding various things that are related to white nationalism, and why and what can we learn by looking at kind of a global comparison. And one thing that's really important for students to understand in this class is that while we are looking at this global phenomenon of white nationalism, is that the histories and local context are extremely important for understanding it. But then especially what we do in the second and third half of the class, we spend a lot of time analyzing the internet and the ways that new technologies have allowed for the creation of these connections and groups and manifestations, but also understandings of white nationalism and who is white and what that means in different contexts. And so I have some notes here, and I can share more about this in the Q&A of just some of the different thematic weeks and units that I do in this class, because again, I teach about definitions around race, around ethnicity, around nation. We spend a lot of time looking at the concept of white, of Caucasian, and how that concept has different meanings and understandings. And we also spend a lot of time looking at eugenics, at anti-Semitism and anti-Ziganism. We also spend quite a bit of time looking at far right and far right movements and the relationship between far right movements and Nazism, neo-Nazism, white nationalism, right? We also look at nationalism and white power in musical forms, and in a lot of ways too, just really understanding how this, how white nationalism travels. And in the third part of the class too, looking a lot at the ways that the media and makes sense of and reports on white nationalism. And so again, last spring was the first time I taught it. This class requires a constant attention to current events. And so I'm preparing to teach it in the spring of 2021. And I'm already thinking about ways that I'm going to be revamping that as well. Also in this class, while we do refer quite a bit to the US, I really get students in all my classes to be thinking about, and most of my students are from the US and have grown up here, but really not just thinking about a one-to-one comparison or even just trying to take American frameworks, but really thinking about, again, the global, right? And thinking about even America as part of the global context, as part of the international context, right? The second class that I will share about, I'm actually preparing it to teach it in the spring of 2021. It's on global race and racism. It's a graduate level course. Significant focus on Russia, Southeast Europe, I'm sorry, I should say Russia, Europe, including Southeast Europe and the US. And I say that to say the reason why that's broken up that way is because many times race is taught within a US or Western Europe framework, or even when race is taught about Europe, Europe often tends to mean Western Europe, right? And so in this class, students and I will be taking a very close focus on how race is defined conceptually and looking at different concepts surrounding race, racism, and racialization. And then we'll be doing more focused studies and looking at areas across Europe, including parts of Russia and the US in a historical context of understanding race and more contemporary. And so I'm still working in developing this class, but I find that a lot of graduate students who are doing work in our region broadly defined of Russian, East European, Eurasian studies have a lot of interest in wanting to study race and racism, but often might lack some of the tools to do so or haven't gotten the opportunity to critically engage the concepts. And so that's what I'm trying to do in this course I'm building. This third course is what I'm teaching right now for undergrads. It's called Global Perspectives of Health, Illness, and Inequality. And it's an undergraduate level course, seminar style, research intensive. And so the students do write, but they also are doing quite a bit of their own independent research about a topic of their choosing. And in this class, race often, so because I'm teaching about health, illness, but also inequality, we're talking a lot about systemic inequality. And so race has played a key role there as well. And again, the importance of that local historical context of race and how that shapes health, illness, and inequality and shaping health outcomes globally. In this class, we focus quite a bit as well on comparisons. I actually ended up revamping this entire course after the pandemic started. And so in this particular moment right now, this week, we're actually looking at epidemics and pandemics in a global context. And we're looking very closely at COVID and HIV and the early days of the diseases, right? And how they manifested. And then over time, which groups are impacted in different ways. And so race plays a huge role there, but also too, the racialization, how people get racialized and how that works with health, with criminalization, with stigma. And so we've had very rich conversations about that in global context. So one of the key things that I have to do when I'm teaching my classes is to really focus on learning and unlearning. And this is really key because a lot of students, especially those who are raised and grew up in the United States, either feel like they have an understanding of race, right? They know they can define it, or there's a resistance to talking about it. They were brought up to think that they couldn't talk about it, they shouldn't talk about it, or they feel that it's something negative and that they're unwilling to have more concrete discussions about it. But in fact, what I find and what many of them often learn themselves too is that they don't have a lot of tools for talking about and discussing race. And so one of the things I do in most of my classes is to do an exercise early on of when did you first learn about race and what did you learn? So here's an example. I normally try to do this where it's interactive around the classroom, and either there's some type of parent share, or I might often use like the big white Post-it sticky notes. And but this example comes from online because right now we're teaching in a very online remote world. So I use this program Mentimeter. This is not an advertisement, but because of the way the program works, I have to. Their logos on the slide. But it's a really good program. And so I have students anonymously answer this question this semester. And it was an opportunity to, in this case, it was, what did you first learn about racism? Because we were talking about and defining what systemic racism is. And so I asked the students this question to see what it was that they learned. And so these were some of the answers from one of the sections. And there was a lot of overlap, a lot of similarities. Many people talked about how they learned it ended with MLK, right? Or it ended with the civil rights movement. Others too had notions about racism as just judging someone based on their skin tone, right? Or others too share more of their own personal experiences of when they encountered racism themselves. This is so this is another example of something I do as well with students, in which so similar to this question of what did you first learn about race or racism and when did you learn it, I also will have students do exercises in a class. So this came from my white nationalism class last year, in which students move around the room and do word associations. And so I had posters around the room, and one of them was nationalism. And so students wrote their answers on the page about what they thought nationalism was or what words come to mind. And then I used a software to create the word cloud, and then presented this back to students the following day as we got ready to define what nationalism is, right? So this is really key, because what I'm getting at is that in order to do this work, in order to really examine and analyze these concepts, it's really important to establish foundational definitions and frameworks. And going back to our conversation from last week's, the first part of the Race in Focus series, people ask questions about varying definitions of race or varying ways of understanding race. And so I want to just reiterate that when I say establishing foundational definitions and frameworks, I'm not necessarily saying that we have to understand race in Eastern Europe the same way we do in the United States. In fact, I'm saying quite the opposite, that we must understand race in its local and historical context, but we have to have a foundational definition or framework at the beginning of the class, because if not, many students bring their own ideas of race and racism and or nationalism, right? And that then is not helpful for critical engagement of these concepts. Another key point too is that, and so students who've taken classes with me know this, is that ultimately we really need to think more critically about racialization, right? So that is how race happens, how race operates, how race itself is defined. Especially thinking about race in a global context, we really have to do deeper studies into racialization and what social factors shape these processes and how race changes over time. Because one thing that my students must learn, and we always talk about, is that race is not, these are not stable categories, right? That understanding race not to be a biological category, but to be a socio-political, socioeconomic category means that it shifts, and this is tied directly to power. But not only that, increasingly, and especially when we think about the relationship between race and health, there are ways that race itself becomes biologized, right? And so in order to have these conversations at this level, we spend quite a few weeks in my classes really just establishing this foundation and this framework. I've included this picture here too as well, because I'm trying to get an idea of a frame. I don't know how well this slide works, but hate, right? Because hate is a term that comes up quite a bit in my classes, and I'm actually developing an undergraduate course right now on hate. But I use this because I'm often asked about the role of hate, and I have students sometimes do quick 1-2 minute writing exercises about this word hate, because I think that when discussing hate itself, it can be one thing, but to define or frame racism regarding hate it does not help students often see things about racist systems, right? And understanding systemic inequality and understanding global systems of race and racism. And so I do spend time with students trying to get at hate and what hate connotates and their understandings of relationship to hate, but also there's a need to really disrupt the more simplistic ideas that racism is about hate, or to someone who's racist is someone who hates other people, right? I often too have my students do some quick writing exercises at the beginning of class around, what it means if I were to say someone's a good, nice racist, because especially for those who have come of age after the 1960s and 1970s, particularly in parts of the United States, but also we can look at this as well as in Western Europe and a lot of the discourse and conversations around tolerance. There is often an idea that if someone is nice or has really good, kind intentions, then we can't understand that person in terms of how they might operate that is shaped by racism or white supremacy or anti-Blackness, right? And so I do some quick writing exercises often at the beginning of class, and maybe some pair and share or small group discussion about them, so that we begin to talk about these concepts together. And then finally, I just want to share that A lot of the courses that I teach are very difficult. It's very scary at times as well. One of my students from my previous class was very interested in studying white nationalism further. And so she and I actually working together for her honors thesis to look at terrorism and the ways that it's racialized, and the ways that this conversations and discourse around who is a terrorist, right, is racialized, especially when we're talking about domestic terrorism in the United States. But she and I have a lot of conversations about how scary this work can be, and then just the level of difficulty, and also the weightiness of doing this work, right? And right now, teaching a class around health and health inequality during a pandemic has actually proven to be very difficult and very weighty in some ways. Though from day one, I try to walk with students and we talk about what it means to do this work. I also try to build in active activities. I call them rehumanizing activities, right? Because in many ways, racism itself is about dehumanization. So we spend a lot of time talking about a dehumanization, and it takes a toll. And so I try to build in activities where we practice rehumanizing one another and building connections together in the class, whether that's something as small as sharing something about ourselves, or also doing one of those maybe 1-2 minute writing reflective exercises that tell something about who we are and allows us to connect to one another. And I do this just because I can see for students that it can be very difficult to delve deeply into these topics. And so I'll stop there now. And if anybody has any further questions about this, we can address them in the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. West Ohiri. We will definitely entertain questions, and I do see they are coming in. But I would like to take the purview of the moderator to just lead off with a few for both you and Dr. Green. So Dr. Green, you want to bring your picture back on? Thank you. I'll start with you. And I just wanted to say that, and I'm sure the audience has felt this too, those images are so striking. And in this day and age where we think we've moved beyond these tropes and these stereotypes. But it's interesting, I do this work on the 20s and 30s, African Americans going there during the time of great internationalism and public pronouncement of brotherhood and things like that. And even in those days, you had the case of the Black and White Film Project, where Langston Hughes and others have gone to work on this film, and they're frustrated by the fact that the director thinks they're not Black enough to be American Negroes. So the color's wrong. And then the other problem is they don't seem to naturally know songs, work songs, and spiritual of the American Blacks. Now, that's happening in the context of the film, which does fall through for various reasons. But then out in the larger society with Meshuggah and the other hosts, they're treated in such a way that is overwhelmingly gratifying to them in terms of the hospitality, the fellowship, and other things. So you had this contradiction of the political public face as far as this cross-national solidarity, and then these images that are these troubling images of how to represent the society in large. So do you want to comment on that? I know you probably have done some work in the early literature. Much of what you were doing in this case is looking at the contemporary picture, but it has, of course, its seeds in earlier contacts between Black Americans in particular and the Soviets in the early days.
Well, initially, yes, I would say that the reception of African Americans was overwhelmingly positive. But I think even in the 40s and in the 50s, and especially when we begin to see Africans come to the Soviet Union to study in large numbers, is when you begin to hear of more racial incidences and more negative experiences. And you would ask, well, why is the lived experiences of many Africans in some ways, why is it so different than the official political stance? And I think that a lot of it, and some of these seeds were actually planted back in the 1920s when the University of the Toilers of the East opened, when the Lenin School opened, and you begin to see in small numbers, to the point, but you begin to see the first African Africans coming to study, and their lives are privileged in many ways, right? They have access to resources and to things that the average Soviet citizen does not have access to. At a time when the living standard of the average Soviet citizen was among the lowest, right, in Europe. And here you have a group of people that is physically, how they present physically, right? They are distinguishable as being not Slavic, right? Not Russian. And I think that there is a resentment that begins to develop, and we see that resentment develop even more as the number of people of African origin, people specifically from the continent, begin to come to the Soviet Union and study in much larger numbers, right? And we see those numbers increase exponentially in the 1950s. And I think there is a sense that this is a group that is being given the opportunity to live in ways that the average Soviet citizen is not. And so, that breeds resentment, right? On a lot of level. It breeds a lot of things that I think are manifested in the overwhelmingly negative experiences that a lot of African students write about, who went to the Soviet Union to study in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And again, quickly, I would say also, when we think about the depiction of African Americans, right, in the Soviet media, what do we see in the 50s and the 60s? We see African Americans being beaten, we see water hoses, we see attack dogs. And I think that psychologically, and I'm not a psychologist, but I think that when those are the only images that you see of a people, right? People in a position of being abused, mistreated, I think there's something somewhere in the psyche that says, maybe those Americans are onto something, right? Yeah. And I don't think that it's intentional. I certainly don't think that it's intentional, but I think that it's something that happened, right? I'm sorry,
thank you for your comment. And certainly when we're talking about our students who are doing study abroad, part of this has to be thought of in terms of the advisement. Professor West O'Heary, could I ask you a quick question as well? And then we will get our audience involved. You were talking about the fact that it's so important to establish foundational definitions in your classes. And certainly I agree with that. I've had similar experiences, but had you not found it challenging to have the sort of abstract environment of the classroom where we have these understandings pitted against the public media generated simplifications in the larger society, which the student is exposed to in much larger amount than in the cloistered environment of your classroom? I mean, it is a challenge in that sense that we try to provide these sanctuaries for safe conversations in a society where the safety is problematic.
Absolutely, that's a great question. And so what I do, especially in my class on white nationalism, is I give students readings. So a great one I use is by Audrey Smedley, who's an anthropologist, and she writes about race, but she also has a great introductory article for students trying to get people to understand that we haven't always related to one another in terms of race, right? And so that one is very good because it gets students thinking about the ways that people were related to one another and were grouped and identified before race. And for a lot of students, I had them do a reading response, a writing response for this reading. For a lot of students, it's somewhat mind-blowing because they some of them will write that, well, I kind of always think about race and kind of always thought that people, that race was around, and so hadn't thought about that. And so I used that article in the beginning, and then we talk quite a bit about the formation of racial categories, looking at the work of people like Linnaeus, like Blumenbach, right? Understanding a lot of the roots of how we got to from these very taxonomical ideas and specious ideas about race, and then trace race. And so when we trace race and look at, media representations of it, I also have done both an in-class activity where we've spent some time on news sites and social media like Twitter, just Googling race or searching for race, right? And kind of building our own word clouds of what is associated with race. But I've also allowed students the opportunity, like I showed you all, to build their own word clouds to input. And then we talk about that in class, about the ways that race is defined, and then and how we define it using our academic sources, but then how race gets talked about in popular media, or the ways that other people understand race, some of the more shorthand definitions. But then we also spend time too looking at, so in particular, like the Albanian context, understandings of race that are both, so people understanding race to still be biological in many ways when we're talking about race or genetics, right? And origins, and how many of those ideas are biologized, but also too, the ways that race could speak to clan, right? Or tribe, or a peoples, right? And then we also look at examples like the World Values Survey that asked a question, and it continually asks, who would you least like to be your neighbor? And in 2013, when this came out, Albanians checked people of another race more than anybody else in Europe, right? But I show this to my students, I show this article in this survey, and I always tell my students to think about two things. How was race understood in this context, right? How was race defined? Was the word a literal translation, and how did people understand race? Because my research shows, right, that word itself is often defined and understood differently across multiple contexts. And that skin color becomes a defining way that a lot of Americans speak about race, but that's not necessarily the case. But then also B, what does it mean around people admitting how they feel about people of another race? Because I sometimes joke, and I was like, maybe we just got more honesty in some other areas than others when it comes to these kinds of surveys, right? But those are just some of the examples I use to teach about the shifting understandings and meanings of race itself.
Thank you, thank you. So let us see, I believe I should look at the Q&A. Is that the correct location? No question or comment? No, that's not it. Let's see. Maybe that's not, I'm looking to see if we have questions. I am a novice to this, and I'm so sorry if I am confusing you. Here's a very good one. And this is actually for both of our presenters. If you can see the question in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen, either one would like to, if you would have the opportunity to teach your courses at a university in our region in English, how would you change your approach to concepts, pedagogy, themes, etc.? Now, I'm assuming this is a question coming from somewhere outside of an English-speaking environment, because we're the question about in our region. Would either of you like to respond to that? Raquel, Dr. Green?
Sure. Well, I have to say that over the past several years, I've been very fortunate to be at Grinnell in the sense that we have, we've been encouraged to think about ways in which we can diversify our curriculum, right? And that is a charge that every department has been given. And, you know, we've been given tools and resources in forms of workshops and seminars and, you know, ability to travel to conferences and whatnot. And so I've been fortunate that I've had the ability to think about these things over a number of years. But I think in terms of my pedagogy, as someone who teaches language in particular, I am a big believer in using the authentic, right? Using authentic resources in as many contexts as you can, right? So moving discussion away from the theory, although the theory is important, right? It's necessary to lay groundwork and foundations. But I think if I can find more ways to include authentic materials, I think that those materials over time have been the ones that really go the furthest in terms of engaging students. So I think that I would continue to work on that aspect of my pedagogy.
Thank you for that. I think too, I like what Raquel said about teaching from an authentic way. And so I'm assuming, for example, if I were to teach this course in Albania or somewhere in the Balkans, then I too would start with more material or images or video that are of the region. But those are the same ones that I engage in my classes here. I just often will start with, well, actually it depends. I've started my classes with material from the Balkans often actually, just to also destabilize the idea that we're just talking about a US phenomenon, right? We're talking about race. But in terms of some of the concepts and pedagogical approaches, I think I would also really situate more around race and representation in the Balkans, right? And so maybe we would start too with looking at music, for example, whether we're talking about hip hop music or pop music and genres, and how race itself gets talked about, because it gets talked about quite a bit, how people understand race. Really, we would kind of delve into a question about race and ethnicity, which is what I do in a lot of my classes here, but the ways that those concepts themselves are often understood, and the ways people articulate belonging that don't necessarily measure up to a US framework or understanding of racial belonging, right? We would do that in the classes as well. I would actually love the opportunity or chance to think about how I could develop my course for a group of students who would be based, and I'm saying our region broadly, right? But that would, I think too, though, that a lot of the themes travel very well, it just need to be situated a bit more in a local context.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the Q&A section and see where I have some questions. There are obviously comments, as we can expect, which is good. We want to have that. Here's one, Dr. West O'Heary. You may see that one. Can you see the question? It says, what are some of the prompts you give your students for writing exercises on hate? You ended your discussion talking about the fact that you do give those students an opportunity to address hate by doing exercises. And I guess a lot of us are curious, I certainly am too, on some of the ways you get the students to do that and to feel comfortable writing about it.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. So I saw that question. I actually took a few notes. So one that I've done recently was I asked students, what is a hate crime and what does it mean if someone's been charged with a hate crime? Like what comes to mind as what something did? And that's an exercise that I do. And then I don't ask students to share if they don't feel comfortable doing so, but most do. And I use an exercise to show how we, in particularly looking at a US society, define and understand hate through what becomes a hate crime, right? And then once we do that, we also talk then in a global context and looking at cases in Russia, for example, looking at cases in Germany, and what gets defined as a hate crime, as a way for us to really think through what is hate. Another writing exercise I've done too is a common refrain that a lot of us have hear, something along the lines of, there's not a racist bone in my body, or I don't hate anyone, there's no hate inside of me, right? And so I get students sometimes to take a few minutes to write about what does that mean about our understandings of hate as something inherent, as something that is a part of us that we're not able to remove, and what does that mean about how we relate to people who are different than us. And so I give students a chance to write about that, give some reflections. I don't collect these, right, but it just gives an opportunity for us to open up a discussion and conversation about hate. And it's also these are good exercises too, to get us thinking about how systems themselves, though, especially systems of inequality and how they function, don't necessarily require any type of animus, right? And so these exercises help us to get at that, but also too, we see the intersecting ways that, hate and racism and animus and prejudice are often entangled, and how we are really trying to disentangle those in these classes.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go back here. Question for Dr. Green. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. Can you talk about how you use Soviet children's literature and film in your classes to teach race and racism? I'm curious how you approach such famous pieces of Soviet children's literature and cinema as Kornei Chukovsky poem, Dr. Aibolit and Chonga Chonga. Chonga Chonga. That may be familiar to you, right?
Thank you for the question. Well, I would say that using Soviet children's literature is a great way, especially when you focus on the visual, is a great way to talk about the contradictions between Soviet public stated policy, attitudes, internationalism, international brotherhood, to talk about the contradictions between those policies and actual depictions and beliefs and attitudes towards Africans. Because I think it's often in the visual, even if you don't understand a word of Russian, you understand how horrific, right, and how utterly offensive those images are. So I actually use a number of images from the 1920s, and I only use the visuals. And so we talk about, okay, we've read what the Soviet, or Soviet declarations on race and, the treatment of Africans who have come to the country, African Americans. But, what can we glean from these images? What are these images telling us? And it's a very stark way, right, to illustrate to students just how big those contradictions are. We do read Dr. Aibolit. We read it in second year Russian, and we watched it in conjunction with the film. And it's interesting because when you're talking about Africa, it's children, children don't go to Africa for anything in the world. So how is Africa depicted? Exotic, savage, the same with Chunga Changa, right? I mean, the life that they're living is idealized, but again, it's very, very primitive. Right? So you see Africans, but rarely do you see them in contemporary contexts, right? It's always this exotic, primitive, savage context that we're dealing with. But, and in terms of film, we watch the film Black and White, of course. There's also There's also a very interesting film that Yevgeny Evtushenko was part of making, I Am Cuba, where it has some very, very interesting depictions and constructions of race. So we watched that as well. But I would say that Soviet children's literature, just as the wealth of material there to work with.
Thank you. Let us see. We just have a few more minutes, but hopefully, okay, Dr. West O'Leary. What is the typical racial ethnic makeup of your classes? I'm wondering how difficult the conversations are, where perhaps only a few students of color who may feel targeted as tokens and arbiter of color, etc. So do you want to address that?
That's a great question. Thank you. So yes, the majority or large parts of my class, the students are white, but we actually addressed this on day one that there will be no singling out someone to speak on behalf of a racial group or to share an experience. I also too, because we also not only do we try to understand, formations around whiteness and Blackness, but I do several units in my courses around experiences of the Roma, for example, right? And so when I have had the opportunity to teach a student who maybe Roma, I make it very clear without even singling out that student, but that we will not create spaces in which somebody feels the pressure that they have to respond to or represent. But I also too began my classes in those early weeks with talking about the difficulties of this material and how we all come to this material and these studies from very different places. And I tend to use myself in this moment too, to talk about how difficult it can be. And so in doing so, I hope to foster more dialogue and more genuine reflection about this. And also too, for instance, I remember we did a couple of weeks, we did a focus looking at the racialization of Jewish persons, and particularly read a chapter from When Jews Became White. And one of my Jewish students spoke in class that day in the discussion and said that I don't feel that I have to speak about this because I am Jewish, but because I am Jewish, this is what I'm going to share. And I felt like she was able to model that practice to say, I don't think I have to be the one to speak about this, but let me tell you about my own particular experience. And I think that's been helpful. I should also say too that I have not yet taught freshman students. Most of my classes have been upper level, and so far I haven't had any freshmen take them. And I think too that in this course I'm developing now for freshman students, those who are new to college, who are new to the university and haven't had the opportunity to discuss race in this way, I feel like there might need to be a different way, more attention paid to this very question, because you're right, this is absolutely a challenge. And just lastly, I'll say, I've had to have a lot of talks with my students of color in office hours, some about these issues, but also just about the ways that they relate to the class. And in many cases, they're very grateful for the opportunity to study race at this level, but they also too will talk with me about what that is like for them. And so I also am grateful to have that space in my student hours. And I reiterate time and time again that I have space for them when they do want to talk about this.
Oh, yes, thank you. And many institutions now, since the spring, have now embraced the idea of particular freshmen, or not freshmen, I guess first year students is the proper term, having some course for students, but as they get older, they have more life experience and you can deal with it slightly differently. But let us see, I have a little more time here. Let's see. Prompts. Okay. Okay. Oh my goodness, this is interesting. Okay, there are two questions about Albania here. Dr. West O'Leary, you can see them, but I'll read them just in case the audience can't. There are two Albanians of color in Tirana. Their father was from Africa, which is sort of the typical, as we were talking about the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc nations, many of them provided scholarships for students from developing countries. Africa provided quite thousands and thousands of students who came up, many of whom stayed or left behind children of color. At any rate, their father was from Africa, so 2 children. One of the girls studied ballet and performed as a dancer in the chorus, for example, on local television programs. So that is a young person who obviously did well in that situation. The other question, also Albania, I'm combining them because our time is short. Since Albania established relations with China after expelling the Soviets when they denounced Stalin, Albania has had a different relationship with China, knew more about its history, etc., than other Balkan countries. So, you know, these people are bringing in many disparate aspects of that. I think that your having studied Albania is for us in our audience a unique opportunity. And hence these questions quite disparate, as you can see, but if you'd like to respond to these, well, sort of question comments that came to us.
Yeah, and so thank you for that. I guess maybe to the people that asked those questions or rose those comments, that's very key. And so while I'm not familiar with this particular family, though I'm wondering if I may know who this person is talking about with the women who grew up in Tirana who had a Black father, and then and by bringing up Albania's history and relationship to China is, yes, again, going back to why that historical and local context is so important, but also too why when we're talking about this category of European and the ways that it's racialized and the ideas of whiteness around that, we really have to do a critical examination of what that means and what that means for those on the margins of whiteness, if you will, right? And how does that category of white capture the experiences of Albanians, for example, or does it, right? What role does religion play in understanding how Albanians themselves are racialized, and particularly how that has taken place in this moment after communism, right? These are all really key questions that I do get at some in the class. And so since this talk is about our pedagogical practices, in the upcoming weeks in my current class, we're going to do more of a focus in looking at socialism and understanding health and healthcare under socialism, and then also understanding health and healthcare after the period of socialism. And so I'm going to be sharing an article that I wrote looking at Roma and Egyptian women and their health outcomes and the ways that racism becomes embodied. And in doing that unit, we're going to also look at what has changed and what has shifted in how race and racial belonging are indexed in the period after communism. And so that is really important for understanding how race operates in Albania and why we can't just do a one-to-one comparison and looking at race and racism from, let's say, Western Europe as looking at Eastern Europe. So thank you for bringing those up. Those are 2 points that, again, situate us in this local context.
Yes, thank you. I will just look to see if there's one more that we can, let's see. Okay, let's see. Well, let's see, a little more down here. I'm so sorry for those of you written in and your question didn't get answered, but we're trying to stay within our time frame. A lot of complimentary things here, long discussion here, but I think that I'll take the advantage of being the moderator at this point. This is, of course, as you know, the second of a series of explorations. But I think that what we've had an opportunity to do here is to look at different aspects of how we can expand our studies to embrace a more diverse perspective of the world at large, which is really what we're engaged in here. Those of us in Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European studies have traditionally focused in a pretty narrow way. And when we have a more diverse cohort of scholars working in this area, they bring diverse perspectives, which again enhance the field. Our time is getting very short. I want to thank you very much for joining us and my colleagues for putting up with me and my technical lack of know-how. I will want to remind those who are watching that this is the second of 4 series, so please do share with us or share with others about the upcoming session. And interestingly enough, the next session is looking at emerging scholars of color abroad. So it's going to be more of a roundtable discussion where people will share with us their experiences. And this is one of two sessions. I think we'll have a similar one following that. So October 16th, look forward to seeing you. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.